Hi, everybody. Brad Truax here from Eastman's Woodlands and Wildlife Committee. And as part of our series on the many trees that we have here in Eastman, New Hampshire, today we're going to talk about birch trees. There you see some beautiful birches in the fall. There are more than 60 birch species, and about 12 common ones, but we only have white and yellow birch here at Eastman. Top shows typical white birch, which is also known as paper birch or canoe birch. And the bottom shows yellow birch. Both birch species are pioneer species. We'll talk about those a little bit later. So, identifying birch trees, there are several things that help us. One is the branch pattern. And again, it's an alternating pattern as opposed to the opposite pattern that we might see with maples or ash trees. The leaf pattern is simple. And really, it's the bark that really leads to unmistakable identification of either white birch or yellow birch. Again, typically, the birch have horizontal markings, and the birch bark peels very easily. So the birch trees are considered pioneer species. What that means is that they're among the first trees to grow after a wildfire or other natural disaster. And they have relatively short lives, particularly the white birch. White birch seldom live longer than about 70 years. Yellow birch tend to live about twice as long as that. And most birch trees are relatively shade intolerant. They need lots of sunlight. And as a result, we tend to see them along the edges of waterways or wetlands or alongside open fields, so places where they can get lots of sunlight. And as the forest matures, they often get choked out by the taller trees that are blocking out the sunlight. In fact, we have a rule of thumb. If you see one dead birch tree, look further into the forest and you're going to see several other dead birch trees. This applies more to the white birch than the yellow birch. Birch are somewhat unique in that they tend to drop their seeds in winter. And we'll talk about how the seeds disperse a little bit later. And those seeds are lightweight, they are wing-like, and they will get blown across the snow. And because they lack shells, they germinate in very unusual places. So birch bark, both birch species have prominent horizontal markings on on the bark, and the bark peels very readily. So again, the top is showing white birch. So again, you have these horizontal markings and bark that's easily peeled. And the bottom is yellow birch, which also has these horizontal markings and bark that peels easily. Birch leaves, the top is showing the leaves of white birch or paper birch. So again, these are a little bit more, some people describe these as diamond shape. I think they look a little bit more heart shaped. Yellow birch leaves on the bottom are a little bit more elongated and little narrower. And both of them have doubly serrated edges. Yellow birch leaves, again, are a bit narrower than the white birch leaves. So white birch is actually the state tree of New Hampshire. I never knew that before we did this video. It is a pioneer species, so it's one of the first species to colonize a area where there was a forest fire or other natural disaster. And these are very shade intolerant. They need lots of sunlight. So as the forest matures, it gets choked out. And we typically see them adjacent to open fields or along streams, wetlands, or shorelines. Again, areas where they're going to get lots of sunlight. And again, that rule of thumb we talked about applies mainly to the white birch. If you see one dead birch tree, look further into the forest and you're likely to see other dead birch trees. And the leaves are green and roughly triangular with a rounded base, and they're sharply double serrated. And the leaves turn bright yellow in the fall. We'll see some pictures of those later on. So the birch bark peels away very easily. This is showing white birch bark being peeled. It's a great fire starter, even when it's wet. And birch bark is a food staple for moose in winter, and it's relatively waterproof. So it's been used for making canoes, wigwams, and a number of other things that are of value because of the waterproofness. So again, birch bark is an excellent fire starter. It ignites at high temperatures even when wet. It can be used as firewood or pulpwood. Native Americans often use birch bark for wigwams or thin strips as a medium for a certain form of art. And of course, you've all heard of birch bark canoes. This is showing a birch bark canoe. Uh, Birch bark, the Native Americans have long used birch bark for making canoes, baskets that can hold water, snowshoes, and other things. And the photo here basically shows how the bark can be harvested when it's ripe, particularly in the summer. So you can take off actually large swaths of the birch bark, and because they're waterproof, they can be used for various things. So white birch and wildlife. White birch is often browsed on by moose. The birch bark is a winter staple food for moose, but even though they tend to eat lots of it, it's of limited nutritional value. So they have to eat other things other than birch bark if they're going to survive the winter. Porcupines and beavers also feed on the inner bark, and snowshoe hares may browse on the seedlings, and many birds and small animals will eat the seeds. Yellow-bellied sapsuckers will drill holes in them to get the sap. We'll talk about the sap later on. This is interesting. Birch polypore is a platform fungus that grows on birch trees, mainly on white birch. So this is showing this typical platform fungus that's called a birch polypore. And it's often also referred to as a tinder fungus because of its great utility in traditional fire making. And it actually has three layers, and I'm not going to bore you with the layers today. Yellow birch is a little more prominent here at Eastman than white birch. Again, yellow birch is one of the dominant trees in many northern hardwood forests, especially along with sugar maple and beech trees. And it's longer lived than the most birch species. It can grow up to over 4 feet in diameter and is said to live as long as 200 to 300 years, though the typical life of a yellow birch is about 150 years. And it's the most shade tolerant of birches, so you're going to see them throughout our forests, as opposed to the white birch, which you'll mainly see just adjacent to open areas. Yellow birch does prefer cool, moist, nutrient-rich soils, so they often grow near eastern hemlocks. And they tend to grow on root balls of fallen trees, from cracks and boulders, or on decaying stumps and mossy logs. More on that in a minute. Because the seedlings can't pierce hard surfaces like compacted leaf litter, they often first spread laterally on the stump of a tree stump or a rock and then go downwards into the soil. And only about 1% of yellow birch seeds actually successfully grow into seedlings. So again, this is showing yellow birch bark. Once again, it's a yellow bronze, it's flaky, and it peels in these fine horizontal strips. And the leaves, again, are oval. They have pointed tips, and they're doubly serrated. And again, these leaves are actually narrower and slightly smaller than the leaves of the white birch. If you see a yellow birch tree, you can break off a branch and strip off the bark at the end and chew it. And what does it taste like? Wintergreen. And that's because it does have wintergreen. Birch seeds are winged chimeras. They fall in off the trees in autumn and winter. And the winter winds slowly disperse the seeds, scatter them in across the snow. And this is showing lots of these little yellow birch seeds. And they're an important food source for songbirds, ruffed grouse, and red squirrels. The seeds don't penetrate leaf litter very well. So seeds tend to germinate best on mossy logs. We'll talk about nurse logs in a minute. They germinate best on decaying wood or cracks in various boulders. And then when the log has eventually rotted away, you're left with this stilt-like root system that can be very prominent. And we'll often see that out in our woods here at Eastman. Nurse logs, again, are fallen, decaying trees that provide nutrients and water and the type of microclimate that new seedlings need to grow and establish themselves. And in this photo, you can actually see a yellow birch seedling, a sapling that's growing up in this nurse log. So yellow birch does have some uses. The wood from yellow birch has been used in flooring, furniture, doors, veneer, cabinetry, gun stocks, even in toothpicks. And the wood varies in color from a reddish brown to a creamy white and accepts stain very readily and can be worked to a very high polish. Oil of wintergreen can be distilled from the bark. Wintergreen, again, contains methyl salicylate. You remember that's something that we see in aspirin. And it's been used as a topical agent for treating arthritis, aches, and pains. And the bark of the yellow birch is very flammable due to its high oil content. So you can actually peel it off and use it as a fire starter, even under very wet conditions. This is showing if you need to start a fire, even in wet conditions, well, you can peel off some yellow birch bark, use this as kindling. And because of that high oil content, it's quite flammable, even when it's wet. So here, this person has actually started a fire using yellow birch bark as kindling. And remember, you could have also used the birch polypore that we saw on that white birch before. Remember, that's a platform fungus, but it's also known as tinder fungus. So yellow birch is important from an ecological standpoint. It can serve as food source for many species. Ruffed grouse and various songbirds and red squirrels feed on the seeds and the buds. Yellow-bellied sapsuckers will drill holes and feed on the sap. And many insects and caterpillars live on yellow birch. And white-tailed deer and moose and cottontails will browse on the branches. And deer may eat the saplings. And the sap can be tapped as a syrup. It actually has a greater flow than that of the maple, but it has a far lower sugar content. So what about birch sap? Did you know you could tap a birch tree for sap? Well, you can. The sap can be tapped as a syrup. Again, it tends to have a greater flow than what we see with maples, but its sugar content is much lower than that of maple sap. But the mechanism differs from the way maples produce sap. Sugar maples rely on freeze-thaw cycles to draw sap up from the roots. On the other hand, sap from birches relies on pressure in the roots that actually pushes the sap upward into the branches. So it's kind of just the opposite of how maple sap works. And the sap in the birch runs later than the maple sap season. It typically runs from the end of maple sap season to just before the leaves appear. So we're probably talking about late February, early March, and maybe into April. Are aspens birch tree? We're often asked this question. Well, no, aspens are not birch trees, but they're often confused with birch trees because they tend to be white with smooth bark and some horizontal markings. This shows the difference. Again, the birch bark peels off like paper, whereas aspen bark does not peel. And again, the leaves are a little bit different. Again, this is showing a typical leaf from a birch tree. This is showing an aspen leaf. And again, they have this flat petiole, flat stem, and that's what allows them to quake or spin when the wind blows on them. You can see our separate video on aspens. Aspens tend to be one of our favorite trees, but they're not birch trees. And in fall, birch trees are often brilliant yellow. And as a result, they're very popular for painters to emulate. So that's a little bit about birch trees. We hope that you've gotten a little bit out of this. And